Margaret Williams sat on her favorite wooden bench in Riverside Park, enjoying the warm spring sunshine that filtered through the old oak trees above her. She had been coming to this exact spot for over 40 years, ever since she and her late husband bought their small house just 3 blocks away. The park was her sanctuary, a place where she could watch the world go by and remember all the good times she had shared with her family in this neighborhood. Today was Tuesday, and like every Tuesday afternoon, she brought a small paper bag filled with breadcrumbs to feed the pigeons that gathered around the fountain nearby. The birds knew her well and would flutter down the moment they saw her familiar floral dress and the worn leather purse that had once belonged to her mother. Margaret smiled as she tossed small handfuls of crumbs onto the ground, watching the pigeons peck eagerly at their feast. She was 72 years old now, a retired school teacher who had spent 35 years teaching 3rd grade at Lincoln Elementary School. Her students had loved her, and even now, years after retirement, she would occasionally run into former students who remembered her kindness and patience. The park was peaceful today, with only a few people scattered across the green lawns. A young mother pushed a stroller along the walking path while talking on her phone. 2 teenagers tossed a frisbee back and forth near the playground equipment. An older gentleman walked his small terrier, stopping occasionally to let the dog sniff at interesting spots along the way. Margaret felt content as she sat there, her hands resting on her lap, thinking about nothing in particular and simply enjoying the beautiful day. She glanced at her watch and saw that it was nearly 3 o'clock. Her son Daniel had called that morning and said he would pick her up from the park around 3:30 to take her to her doctor's appointment. Daniel was always punctual, a trait he had inherited from his father. Margaret felt proud when she thought about her son. He had worked so hard to become a successful attorney, and now he was a senior partner at one of the biggest law firms in the city. She remembered how he used to sit at the kitchen table doing his homework while she graded papers, both of them working side by side in comfortable silence. The peaceful atmosphere of the afternoon was suddenly interrupted when Margaret noticed 2 police officers walking toward her bench. They were both young men, probably in their early 30s, wearing dark blue uniforms and carrying all the equipment that police officers typically wore on their belts. One was tall with short blonde hair and a stern expression on his face. The other was slightly shorter with dark hair and eyes that seemed to look at everything with suspicion. Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness in her chest, but told herself there was nothing to worry about. She had done nothing wrong. She was just sitting on a public bench in a public park, something she had every right to do. The taller officer reached her bench first and stood directly in front of her, blocking her view of the fountain and the pigeons. His nameplate read Porter. The other officer, whose nameplate said Hoffman, moved to stand slightly to the side as if positioning himself to cut off any escape route. Margaret looked up at them with a polite but puzzled expression, wondering what they could possibly want from an elderly woman feeding birds in the park. Officer Porter spoke first, his voice cold and official. He asked Margaret what she was doing in this area. The question confused her because the answer seemed obvious. She was sitting on a bench in a public park, but she answered politely anyway, explaining that she was just feeding the birds and waiting for her son to pick her up. Porter did not seem satisfied with this answer. He exchanged a glance with Hoffman, and Margaret could see something in their eyes that made her increasingly uncomfortable. Hoffman stepped closer and asked Margaret where she lived. She told him she lived on Maple Street, just 3 blocks from the park. He asked her how long she had lived there, and she explained that she had been in the same house for over 40 years. Porter then said something that made Margaret's heart sink. He claimed they had received reports of suspicious activity in the area and needed to see her identification. Margaret felt confused and hurt by this request. What suspicious activity could they possibly be talking about? She had been sitting peacefully on a bench, harming no one. Despite her confusion, Margaret knew it was best to cooperate with the police. She reached for her purse, which sat beside her on the bench, intending to retrieve her wallet and show them her driver's license. But as her hand moved toward the purse, Porter suddenly tensed up and moved even closer to her. He asked her in a sharp voice what she was reaching for. Margaret froze, her hand hovering over the purse. She explained that she was just getting her identification, as he had requested. Porter told her to move slowly and keep her hands where he could see them. Margaret felt her hands beginning to tremble as she slowly unzipped her purse and reached inside for her wallet. She had never been treated this way before, and it frightened her. She had always respected the police and had taught her students to trust law enforcement officers. But there was something about the way these two officers were looking at her, something in their tone of voice and body language, that made her feel like a criminal even though she had done absolutely nothing wrong. She pulled out her wallet and opened it to show her driver's license. Porter took the wallet from her hands and examined the license carefully, tilting it back and forth as if checking to see whether it was fake. He read her name aloud, Margaret Williams, and her address. He asked her what she did for a living, and she explained that she was retired. He asked what she had done before retirement, and she told him she had been a school teacher. Hoffman wrote something down in a small notebook he had pulled from his pocket. Margaret could see that a few people in the park had stopped what they were doing and were watching the scene with interest. The young mother with the stroller had paused on the path and was looking over with concern. The man walking his dog had stopped as well, standing about 20 feet away with a frown on his face. The teenagers with the frisbee had stopped their game and were openly staring at the officers and the elderly woman on the bench. Margaret felt embarrassed and humiliated, wondering what these people must be thinking as they watched two police officers question her as if she were some kind of threat to public safety. Officer Porter continued to hold Margaret's wallet in his hands, staring at her driver's license as if it contained some hidden secret that would reveal her as a criminal. He asked her again why she was in this particular park, in this particular neighborhood, as if the answer she had already given him twice was somehow insufficient. Margaret tried to remain calm and polite, despite the growing fear and frustration she felt inside. She explained once more that she had lived in this neighborhood for over 40 years, and came to this park several times a week. It was her neighborhood, her park, and she had every right to be there. Hoffman walked around to stand behind the bench, and Margaret felt trapped between the two officers. She did not like having someone standing behind her where she could not see them. It made her feel vulnerable and anxious. She turned her head to look at Hoffman, but Porter told her to keep her eyes forward and focus on him. The tone of his voice was sharp and commanding, as if he were speaking to someone who had committed a serious crime rather than an elderly woman sitting peacefully in a park. Porter asked Margaret if she had any weapons on her. The question shocked her so much that for a moment she could not even respond. Weapons? She was a 72-year-old retired school teacher who spent her days reading books, visiting with friends, and feeding birds in the park. The idea that she would be carrying a weapon was absurd. She told Porter that of course she had no weapons. He asked if he could search her purse. Margaret hesitated. She knew that citizens had rights, and she was not sure whether she was required to let him search her belongings. But she also knew that refusing might make the situation worse, and she was already frightened enough. She told Porter that he could look in her purse if he really felt it was necessary. He set her wallet down on the bench and picked up her purse, holding it up and examining it from all angles. He made a comment about how nice the purse looked, asking her where she had gotten it. Margaret explained that it had belonged to her mother and was over 30 years old. Porter raised his eyebrows and exchanged another look with Hoffman. He said something about the purse looking expensive and asked Margaret how a retired schoolteacher could afford such nice things. Margaret felt her face grow hot with anger and humiliation. The implication in his words was clear, and it hurt her deeply. She had worked hard her entire life, saved her money carefully, and lived modestly. The purse had been a gift from her mother, not something she had bought herself, and certainly not something she had obtained through any illegal means. But Porter's tone suggested that he did not believe an elderly black woman could legitimately own anything of value without having stolen it or acquired it through some criminal activity. By now, more people in the park had stopped to watch what was happening. The young mother with the stroller had pulled out her phone and appeared to be recording the encounter. The man with the dog was also holding up his phone, filming the scene. Several other people had gathered nearby, forming a loose circle around the bench where Margaret sat. She could hear them whispering to each other, and some of them were shaking their heads in disgust at how the officers were treating her. Hoffman stepped around from behind the bench and asked Margaret if she had any identification other than her driver's license. She told him that her driver's license was the only identification she had with her. He asked if she had a passport or a birth certificate. Margaret was confused by these questions. Why would she carry her birth certificate with her to the park? She told him that those documents were at home. Hoffman asked for her social security number, and Margaret recited it for him, though she felt uncomfortable giving out such personal information in front of all these strangers. Porter opened her purse and began pulling items out one by one, setting them on the bench beside her. He removed a small coin purse, a package of tissues, a tube of lipstick, a pair of reading glasses, a bottle of prescription medication, a small calendar, and a folded church bulletin from last Sunday's service. He held up the prescription bottle and read the label aloud, asking Margaret what the medication was for. She explained that it was for her blood pressure, which her doctor had prescribed years ago. Porter asked if she had a prescription slip to prove the medication was legally hers. Margaret told him that the prescription information was on the bottle itself, as it always was, and that she had been taking this medication for over 10 years. Hoffman pulled out his radio and called in Margaret's name and driver's license number to check for any warrants or criminal history. Margaret sat there listening to him recite her personal information over the radio for anyone to hear. She had never felt so humiliated in her entire life. She was a respectable woman who had spent her career teaching children to read and write, who had been married to the same man for 43 years until his death, who attended church every Sunday and volunteered at the community center, and now she was being treated like a criminal in full view of her neighbors and strangers. The radio crackled with a response. Hoffman listened and then told Porter that there were no warrants and no criminal record. Margaret would have laughed if she had not been so upset. Of course there were no warrants or criminal records. She had never even received a parking ticket in her entire life, but the officers did not seem satisfied with this information. Instead of apologizing for the inconvenience and letting her go, they continued to question her. Porter asked Margaret where her son was and what he did for a living. She told him that her son was an attorney and would be arriving soon to pick her up for a doctor's appointment. Porter smirked and said something to Hoffman that Margaret could not quite hear, but she saw them both smile in a way that suggested they did not believe her. Hoffman made a comment about how everyone claimed to have a lawyer in the family when they got stopped by the police. Margaret felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, but she refused to cry in front of these men. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break down. She took a deep breath and tried to steady herself. She thought about her late husband and what he would say if he were here. He had always told her to stand up for herself and not let anyone treat her as if she were less than she was. She thought about her son Daniel and knew that he would be outraged when he arrived and saw what was happening. Porter continued to go through her purse, examining each item as if it might contain evidence of some crime. He found the small amount of cash she kept in her coin purse, about $40 in bills of various denominations. He pulled out the money and held it up, asking Margaret where she had gotten it. She stared at him in disbelief. Where did he think she had gotten it? From the bank, like everyone else. She told him that it was her own money that she had withdrawn from her savings account. Porter asked if she had a receipt to prove it. Margaret told him that she did not keep receipts for cash withdrawals from 2 weeks ago. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, and Margaret could hear people talking more loudly now. Someone said that this was racial profiling and that the officers should be ashamed of themselves. Another person called out that they were recording everything and would make sure this video got posted online. A woman shouted that the officers should leave the poor lady alone and find some real criminals to harass. But despite the growing disapproval from the crowd, Porter and Hoffman continued their interrogation of Margaret. Margaret sat motionless on the bench as Officer Porter continued to examine her belongings spread out beside her. Every personal item from her purse now lay exposed for everyone to see. Her prescription medication, her reading glasses, her lipstick, her coin purse with the $40 inside, and the church bulletin that announced next week's choir practice. These were the intimate details of her life, displayed like evidence at a crime scene, and she felt violated in a way she had never experienced before. Hoffman picked up the church bulletin and unfolded it, reading through the announcements as if they might contain some coded message about criminal activity. He asked Margaret which church she attended. She told him it was Grace Community Church on Oak Avenue, where she had been a member for 25 years. She sang in the choir and helped organize the monthly food drive for families in need. Hoffman asked if she could prove she was a member of this church. Margaret did not understand what kind of proof he wanted. Did he expect her to have a membership card? She told him that Pastor Lewis could vouch for her if necessary, but she did not carry any documentation about her church membership. Porter held up one of the photographs that had been tucked into a side pocket of her purse. It was a picture of Margaret with her son Daniel, taken at his law school graduation 15 years ago. Both of them were smiling broadly in the photo, and Daniel wore his graduation robe and cap. Porter looked at the photo and then at Margaret. He asked if this was really her son. Margaret said yes, that was her son Daniel, and she was very proud of him. Porter asked what kind of law Daniel practiced. Margaret explained that he worked at a large firm downtown and specialized in civil rights cases. The mention of civil rights seemed to change something in Porter's expression. He put the photo down and picked up Margaret's wallet again, examining it more closely this time. He asked her how much money she made when she was teaching. Margaret told him that teacher salaries were public record, and he could look it up if he was interested. She explained that she had retired on a modest pension and Social Security, and she lived comfortably but not extravagantly. Everything she owned had been earned through hard work and careful saving. Hoffman radioed in again, this time asking for additional information about Margaret's address. He wanted to know if there had been any calls to police from that address or any complaints from neighbors. Margaret listened in growing disbelief. Why were they checking her address? What did they think they would find? She had lived quietly in her house for decades, bothering no one, maintaining her property, and being a good neighbor to everyone around her. The radio response came back negative. There had been no calls from her address and no complaints about her or her property. Hoffman seemed frustrated by this news. He asked Margaret if she lived alone. She told him that yes, she had lived alone since her husband passed away 8 years ago. He asked if anyone else had keys to her house. Margaret wondered what possible relevance this question could have. She explained that her son had a spare key in case of emergencies, and that was all. Porter picked up the prescription bottle again and read the label more carefully. He asked Margaret for the name and phone number of her doctor. She told him the information was on the bottle itself, but she recited it anyway. He asked how often she saw her doctor. Margaret explained that she had regular checkups every 3 months to monitor her blood pressure and overall health. Porter asked if she had any other medical conditions. Margaret felt that this question crossed a line into her private medical information, but she answered anyway, explaining that she had mild arthritis but was otherwise in good health for her age. The crowd of witnesses had grown to more than a dozen people now, and they were becoming increasingly vocal in their disapproval of what was happening. A middle-aged man in a business suit stepped closer and asked the officers what crime they suspected Margaret of committing. Porter told him to step back and mind his own business. The man refused to move and said that as a citizen, he had every right to observe police conduct in a public place. Another woman called out that she had already called the news station, and they were sending a reporter to cover the story. Hoffman turned toward the crowd and raised his voice, telling them all to disperse and stop interfering with police business. But no one moved. Instead, more people pulled out their phones and began recording. Margaret could see at least 6 phones pointed in her direction, all capturing video of her humiliation. She felt grateful for these witnesses, even as she felt mortified that strangers were seeing her treated this way. At least there would be evidence of what happened here today. Porter asked Margaret again about the $40 in her coin purse. He wanted to know exactly when she had withdrawn it from the bank and which bank branch she had used. Margaret tried to remember. She thought it had been about 2 weeks ago, and she usually went to the branch on Main Street because it was close to her house. But she could not remember the exact date. Porter seized on this uncertainty, suggesting that perhaps the money had not come from a bank at all. Margaret felt her anger rising. What was he implying? That she had stolen $40 from somewhere? The accusation was so ridiculous that she almost wanted to laugh, except that nothing about this situation was funny. Hoffman asked if they could search Margaret physically to make sure she was not carrying anything dangerous. This request finally broke through Margaret's patience. She said firmly that no, they could not search her, and that she had cooperated fully with all their questions even though she did not understand why she was being treated this way. She told them that she had shown them her identification, answered all their questions, and allowed them to go through her purse. She had done nothing wrong, and she wanted them to return her belongings and let her go. Porter's expression hardened. He told Margaret that she was being uncooperative and that her attitude was making him suspicious. He said that if she had nothing to hide, she should not object to a simple search. Margaret felt trapped. She knew that she had rights, But she also knew that asserting those rights might make these officers angry, and she was already frightened about what they might do. She was an elderly woman alone with two armed officers who seemed determined to find something wrong with her. A woman in the crowd called out that Margaret did not have to consent to a search without probable cause. The woman said she was a paralegal and knew the law. She told Margaret not to let them bully her. Porter spun around and pointed at the woman, telling her that she was interfering with an investigation and could be arrested. The woman did not back down. She said she was exercising her First Amendment right to observe and comment on police activity in a public space. Hoffman pulled out his radio again and called for backup. He reported that they had a situation in Riverside Park with an uncooperative suspect and a hostile crowd. Margaret felt panic rising in her chest. An uncooperative suspect? A hostile crowd? How had feeding birds in the park turned into this nightmare? She looked at her watch and saw that it was 3:20. Daniel would be here in 10 minutes. She prayed that he would arrive soon because she did not know how much more of this she could endure. Porter began putting her belongings back into her purse, but he did it carelessly, shoving items in without any organization. When he finished, he set the purse on the bench but kept her wallet in his hand. He told Margaret that they were going to hold on to her identification until backup arrived and they could sort out what was really going on here. Margaret protested that he had no right to keep her identification. She had shown it to him as requested and now she wanted it back. Porter ignored her protest. Within just a few minutes, Margaret heard sirens approaching. 2 more police cars pulled up to the curb near the park, and 4 additional officers got out and walked toward the bench where she sat. Margaret's heart sank as she realized the situation was escalating rather than resolving. She was now surrounded by 6 police officers, all of them treating her as if she were some kind of dangerous criminal, rather than a grandmother who had been feeding birds and waiting for her son. The 4 new officers approached the bench where Margaret sat surrounded by her scattered belongings and the growing crowd of witnesses. Among them was a man who appeared to be senior in rank, with gray hair at his temples and more stripes on his uniform than the others. His nameplate identified him as Lieutenant Greg Murphy. He looked around at the scene with an expression that suggested he was trying to assess what was happening and why backup had been called to deal with an elderly woman in a park. Murphy walked up to Porter and asked him to explain the situation. Porter immediately launched into a description of events that bore little resemblance to what had actually happened. He claimed that they had observed Margaret acting suspiciously and had approached her to ask routine questions. He said that she had become defensive and uncooperative when they asked for identification. He mentioned the $40 in her possession and implied that they had reason to believe it might be connected to illegal activity in the area. He said that when they tried to conduct a lawful search, she had refused and the crowd had become hostile and threatening toward the officers. Margaret listened to this distorted version of events with her mouth open in shock. Almost nothing, Porter said, was true. She had not been acting suspiciously. She had cooperated fully with their questions and had willingly shown her identification. She had not become defensive until they began treating her like a criminal and implying that her belongings were stolen. And she had only refused a physical search after they had already gone through everything in her purse and found nothing whatsoever that justified their suspicion. Murphy turned to look at Margaret, and she met his eyes with as much dignity as she could muster. She could see him taking in her appearance, her age, her floral dress, the church bulletin visible among her things on the bench. For a moment she thought she saw a flicker of doubt cross his face, as if he was questioning whether this elderly woman could really be the dangerous, uncooperative suspect that Porter had described over the radio. But then his expression became neutral and professional again. Murphy asked Margaret for her side of the story. She took a deep breath and explained as calmly as she could that she had been sitting peacefully on this bench, feeding the birds as she did several times a week. She told him that Porter and Hoffman had approached her and asked what she was doing here, as if she did not belong in this park. She described how they had demanded her identification, gone through her purse, questioned her about every item she owned, and kept her wallet even after confirming she had no criminal record or warrants. She explained that she had answered every question they asked and had done nothing to justify this treatment. Murphy listened without interrupting, but his expression gave nothing away. When Margaret finished speaking, he asked her why she thought the officers had stopped her in the first place. The question felt like a trap. Margaret knew what he was really asking. He wanted to know if she was going to accuse them of racial profiling. She hesitated, not wanting to make the situation worse, but also knowing that she had to speak the truth. She said quietly that she believed they stopped her because she was a black woman sitting in a park, and they assumed she did not belong here. Porter immediately objected, saying that race had nothing to do with it, and that they had received a call about suspicious activity. Murphy asked him what the specific complaint had been. Porter seemed to hesitate before answering. He said something vague about someone reporting a person acting strangely near the fountain. Murphy asked if the caller had provided a description of this person. Porter said he could not remember the exact details of the description. One of the witnesses in the crowd called out that this was clearly racial profiling and that everyone present could see it. Another person shouted that the officers should be ashamed of themselves for harassing a grandmother. A third voice demanded that the officers return Margaret's property and apologize to her. The crowd was growing not just in size but in anger, and Murphy seemed to recognize that the situation could easily spiral out of control if it was not handled carefully. Hoffman stepped forward and tried to justify their actions by pointing out that there had been several burglaries in the neighborhood recently and they were just being cautious. But this explanation only seemed to make things worse. A man in the crowd yelled that being cautious did not give them the right to harass innocent people. A woman pointed out that there were several other people in the park who had not been stopped and questioned, and asked why Margaret had been singled out. Margaret felt exhausted and overwhelmed. Her legs ached from sitting tensely on the hard bench for so long. Her hands were still trembling. She wanted nothing more than for this ordeal to end so she could go home, lock her door, and try to forget this horrible afternoon. But the officers showed no signs of letting her leave. They seemed determined to justify their actions by finding something, anything, that would make their suspicion seem reasonable. Murphy asked Margaret where she was planning to go after leaving the park. She told him that her son was picking her up to take her to a doctor's appointment. Murphy asked for her son's name and contact information. Margaret gave him Daniel's name and cell phone number. Murphy asked what kind of doctor she was seeing. Margaret explained that it was just a routine checkup with her primary care physician. Murphy wrote all this information down in a small notebook. One of the other officers who had arrived with the backup cars asked Porter if they had checked Margaret for outstanding warrants in other jurisdictions. Porter said they had only checked locally. The officer suggested they should do a more thorough search of national databases. Margaret could not believe what she was hearing. They wanted to search national databases for warrants? She had never even left the state except for one trip to visit her sister in Virginia 20 years ago. The idea that she might have warrants in other jurisdictions was absurd. Murphy seemed to consider this suggestion, but then shook his head. He said they had no reason to believe she had warrants elsewhere if she had none locally. At least he seemed to have some common sense, Margaret thought. But then he told Margaret that she was going to have to remain in the park until they could verify her story about her son and the doctor's appointment. Margaret protested that this was unnecessary. Her son would be arriving any minute and could confirm everything she had said. Murphy said they would wait for him to arrive. Margaret looked at her watch again. It was now 3:25. Daniel should be here in just 5 minutes. She tried to take comfort in knowing that her ordeal would soon be over. Daniel would arrive, explain who he was, and straighten out this whole terrible misunderstanding. But a small part of her worried that even Daniel's arrival might not be enough to satisfy these officers who seemed so determined to prove that she had done something wrong. The crowd remained in place, with many people still recording everything on their phones. Margaret was grateful for their presence. She knew that without these witnesses, the situation might have been even worse. The officers might have felt free to be even more aggressive if they had not been aware that their actions were being documented. She made eye contact with a few of the people in the crowd, trying to convey her thanks silently. Several of them nodded back at her with expressions of sympathy and support. Hoffman walked a short distance away and made a phone call on his cell phone, rather than using his radio. Margaret could not hear what he was saying, but she saw him glancing back at her several times during the conversation. When he finished the call, he walked back to Murphy and spoke to him in a voice too low for Margaret to hear. Murphy nodded and said something brief in response. Porter picked up Margaret's purse again and looked through it once more, as if he might have missed something the first time. He pulled out her reading glasses and examined them closely, then put them back. He took out her coin purse and counted the money again, making sure the amount was still $40. Margaret wanted to scream at him to stop touching her things, but she forced herself to remain calm and silent. Getting angry would only make things worse. Murphy asked Margaret how long she had lived in her house on Maple Street. She told him again that it had been over 40 years. He asked if she owned the house or rented it. Margaret said she owned it outright, having paid off the mortgage 10 years ago with money from her late husband's life insurance policy. Murphy asked if she had any proof of ownership with her. Margaret said of course not. Why would she carry her house deed to the park? Murphy said he was just trying to verify her story. At exactly 3:30, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb near where the police cars were parked. Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her when she recognized the car as belonging to her son Daniel. The driver's door opened and Daniel stepped out, and Margaret had never been so happy to see anyone in her entire life. He stood beside his car for a moment, taking in the scene before him with a practiced lawyer's eye. Margaret could see him counting the officers, noting the crowd of witnesses with their phones out, observing the way his mother sat surrounded by police while her belongings were spread out on the bench beside her. Daniel was 45 years old and cut an impressive figure in his tailored navy suit. He carried a leather briefcase in one hand and moved with the confident stride of someone who was used to commanding attention in courtrooms. His expression remained calm and controlled, but Margaret knew her son well enough to see the anger burning behind his eyes. He walked toward the bench where she sat, his shoes clicking purposefully on the concrete path. Officer Porter stepped forward as if to block Daniel's approach, but Daniel simply walked around him without breaking stride. He spoke in a clear, caring voice that was designed to be heard not just by the officers, but by every person in the crowd and every phone recording the encounter. He identified himself as Daniel Williams, attorney at law, and stated that he was Margaret Williams' son and legal counsel. He asked his mother in a gentle tone if she had been injured in any way. Margaret shook her head but told him she was frightened and upset. Daniel turned to face the officers, and his tone shifted from gentle to professionally authoritative. He asked which officer was in charge of this situation. Lieutenant Murphy stepped forward and identified himself. Daniel asked Murphy to explain the legal basis for detaining his mother. Murphy began to repeat the explanation that Porter had given earlier about suspicious activity and routine questioning. Daniel listened without interrupting, but Margaret could see a muscle twitching in his jaw, which was always a sign that he was struggling to control his anger. When Murphy finished speaking, Daniel asked several pointed questions. Had his mother been accused of committing a crime? Murphy admitted that she had not. Had there been a specific complaint against her? Murphy said there had been a general report of suspicious activity in the area. Daniel asked what specifically about his mother's behavior had appeared suspicious. Murphy seemed to struggle with this question. He said something about her being in the park and the officers wanting to verify her identity. Daniel pulled a small notebook from his pocket and began writing things down. He asked for the badge numbers of all the officers present. He asked for the specific time the initial contact with his mother had been made. He asked whether his mother had been free to leave at any point during this encounter. Murphy hesitated before answering that last question. He said that she had not been under arrest, but that they had needed to verify certain information before letting her go. Daniel's voice became sharper. He pointed out that if his mother had not been free to leave, then she had effectively been detained, and there needed to be reasonable suspicion of criminal activity to justify such detention. He asked again what specific criminal activity his mother was suspected of committing. Murphy could not provide a satisfactory answer. He repeated something about suspicious behavior and routine questioning, but his words sounded increasingly hollow even to Margaret's ears. Porter tried to interject, saying that Margaret had been uncooperative and defensive. Daniel turned his full attention to Porter, and Margaret saw the officer actually take a small step backward. Daniel asked Porter to define exactly how his mother had been uncooperative. Porter mentioned that she had refused to consent to a physical search. Daniel's eyebrows rose. He asked whether Porter had probable cause to search his mother. Porter said he had wanted to make sure she was not carrying anything dangerous. Daniel asked if his mother had made any threatening gestures or statements. Porter admitted that she had not. Daniel then asked if his mother had voluntarily shown her identification when requested. Porter said yes. Daniel asked if the identification check had revealed any warrants or criminal history. Porter admitted that it had not. Daniel asked if his mother had answered the officer's questions. Porter said she had, but claimed her attitude had been problematic. Daniel asked Porter to specify exactly what he meant by a problematic attitude. Porter seemed unable to articulate a clear answer. Turning back to Murphy, Daniel asked if his mother's belongings had been searched. Murphy confirmed that her purse had been examined. Daniel asked if anything illegal had been found. Murphy admitted that nothing illegal had been found. Daniel asked why the search had been conducted if there was no probable cause. Murphy tried to explain that it had been a consensual search, but Daniel cut him off by asking his mother directly whether she had genuinely consented or whether she had felt pressured and intimidated. Margaret said honestly that she had felt pressured and frightened. Daniel pulled out his phone and made a call while the officers watched. He spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. He asked for the police commissioner by name and said that he needed to report an incident of what appeared to be racial profiling and unlawful detention. There was a pause while someone on the other end of the line responded. Daniel gave the location and stated that 6 officers were currently detaining his 72-year-old mother without probable cause. Another pause, and then Daniel said he would wait for the commissioner to arrive. Murphy's face had gone pale. He clearly had not expected the situation to escalate to the point where the police commissioner would be personally involved. He tried to explain that this was all just a misunderstanding and that they were simply being cautious in their duties. Daniel interrupted him. He said that detaining an elderly woman who was peacefully feeding birds in a park was not cautious police work, but rather harassment and a violation of her constitutional rights. Daniel made another call, this time to someone he addressed as Linda. He explained the situation briefly and asked if she could come to Riverside Park immediately to document what had happened. He mentioned that there were multiple witnesses and video recordings. He told Linda that he would be filing a formal complaint and potentially a civil lawsuit. When he ended the call, he informed Murphy that he had just contacted an attorney who specialized in police misconduct cases and that she was on her way. Hoffman spoke up for the first time since Daniel's arrival. He tried to defend their actions by saying that there had been burglaries in the neighborhood and they were just doing their jobs. Daniel asked him how many burglaries had occurred. Hoffman said he thought there had been 3 or 4 in the past month. Daniel asked what those burglaries had to do with an elderly woman sitting on a bench feeding birds. Hoffman could not provide a logical answer. Daniel made a third call, and this time Margaret heard him speaking to someone from a newspaper. He described what had happened to his mother and said he thought it would make an important story about ongoing issues with racial profiling in the city. He gave the reporter the location and suggested that someone come to the park as soon as possible while witnesses were still present. When he finished that call, he looked directly at Murphy and said that he hoped the department was prepared for the public scrutiny this incident was going to receive. The crowd had grown even larger during Daniel's arrival and his phone calls. People were openly cheering and applauding him as he confronted the officers. Someone called out that it was about time these cops faced consequences for their behavior. Another person shouted support for Margaret and said she hoped Margaret sued the department for everything she could get. The mood of the crowd had shifted from concerned observation to active support for Margaret and her son. Murphy tried once more to defuse the situation. He suggested that perhaps everyone could calm down and discuss this rationally. He said that maybe there had been some miscommunication, and they could resolve this without involving the commissioner or the press. Daniel looked at him coldly and said that the time for rational discussion had passed when the officers decided to harass his mother and humiliate her in public. He said that he intended to pursue every available legal remedy and to ensure that the officers involved faced appropriate consequences for their actions. Daniel walked over to the bench and gently helped his mother to her feet. He picked up her belongings from the bench and carefully placed them back in her purse, treating each item with respect and care, a stark contrast to the way Porter had roughly shoved everything in earlier. He held out his hand to Porter and said firmly that he wanted his mother's wallet and identification returned immediately. Porter still held Margaret's wallet in his hand and seemed reluctant to give it up, as if holding onto it gave him some power in the situation. Daniel repeated his request. adding that he could either return the wallet voluntarily or explain to the police commissioner why he had continued to withhold a citizen's property without legal justification. Porter handed over the wallet with obvious reluctance. Daniel checked to make sure all of his mother's identification and money were still inside, then gave the wallet to Margaret. He asked her again if she was hurt or if she needed medical attention. Margaret assured him that she was physically fine, just shaken and upset by the whole experience. Daniel put his arm around her shoulders in a protective gesture and told her that everything would be okay now and that he would make sure nothing like this ever happened to her again. Murphy attempted to assert some authority over the situation by saying that they still needed to file a report about the incident. Daniel turned to face him with an expression that made it clear he was not intimidated in the slightest. He told Murphy that yes, there would definitely be reports filed about this incident, but those reports would be filed by him and would be complaints against the officers for violating his mother's civil rights. He explained that his mother had been subjected to an unlawful detention, an illegal search, and what appeared to be clear racial profiling. Daniel began to list the specific legal violations that had occurred. He mentioned the Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. He cited the Supreme Court case of Terry v. Ohio and explained that the officers had lacked reasonable suspicion to detain his mother in the first place. He pointed out that asking someone sitting peacefully on a bench what they were doing and where they lived suggested the officers believed she did not belong there, which indicated bias. He noted that going through her purse and questioning her about the source of her money, when they had found no evidence of criminal activity, constituted an unreasonable search. Murphy tried to interrupt, but Daniel held up his hand and continued speaking. He mentioned the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection under the law. He asked Murphy to explain why his mother had been singled out for questioning when there were multiple other people in the park who had not been stopped. He asked whether the officers had questioned the young white mother with the stroller or the white man walking his dog. Murphy did not answer. Daniel then revealed something that made all the officers visibly uncomfortable. He pulled out a business card and handed it to Murphy. The card identified him as Daniel Williams, senior partner at Harass and Associates, one of the most prestigious law firms in the city. But more importantly, the card also noted that Daniel served on the city's Civilian Oversight Board for Police Accountability. Murphy's eyes widened as he read the card. He clearly recognized the name of the law firm and understood the implications of Daniel's position on the Oversight Board. But Daniel was not finished. He mentioned that his firm had recently won a landmark settlement in a civil rights case against the city's police department for a pattern of racial profiling. The case had resulted in a multi-million-dollar payout and had led to mandatory training for all officers on constitutional rights and bias awareness. He asked Murphy if he and his officers had completed that training. Murphy nodded stiffly. Daniel said it appeared the training had not been very effective given what had just happened to his mother. Hoffman tried to defend himself by saying that they had just been doing their jobs and following their training. Daniel asked him to specify exactly what training told them to detain elderly women who were feeding birds in parks. Hoffman could not answer. Daniel pointed out that if their training had indeed told them to do what they did, then the problem was even bigger than individual officer misconduct and indicated systemic issues within the department that would need to be addressed. Daniel mentioned that he was personal friends with the mayor, having worked on several city initiatives related to criminal justice reform. He said he would be discussing this incident with the mayor at their next meeting. He also mentioned that he had the personal phone numbers of 3 federal judges who would be very interested to hear about civil rights violations occurring in broad daylight in a public park. With each name and connection Daniel mentioned, the officers seemed to shrink a little more. One of the other officers who had come with the backup, a younger man who had mostly remained silent throughout the encounter, spoke up nervously. He said that he had only arrived after the initial contact and had just been following orders from his superiors. Daniel looked at him and said that following orders was not a defense for violating someone's constitutional rights. He pointed out that every officer had an obligation to speak up when they witnessed misconduct by their colleagues. The young officer looked down at his feet and said nothing more. Daniel pulled out his phone again and began taking photographs. He photographed the scene from multiple angles, He took pictures of all the officers, making sure their faces and badge numbers were clearly visible. He photographed his mother sitting on the bench looking tired and distressed. He photographed the crowd of witnesses who were still recording everything. He explained that he was documenting the scene for the legal proceedings that would follow. Murphy made one last attempt to control the narrative. He suggested that perhaps this had all been an unfortunate misunderstanding, and that they could resolve it without formal complaints. He said that maybe the officers had been overzealous in their interpretation of their duties, but that their intentions had been good. Daniel cut him off sharply. He said that good intentions did not excuse constitutional violations. He pointed out that his mother was a 72-year-old retired schoolteacher who had lived in this neighborhood for 4 decades and had every right to sit in this park. Without being harassed by police, Daniel stated clearly that he would be filing formal complaints against officers Porter and Hoffman for their initial contact with his mother and their subsequent conduct. He said he would also be filing a complaint against Murphy for failing to properly assess the situation when he arrived and for allowing his officers' misconduct to continue. He mentioned that he would be requesting the personnel files of all officers involved to determine whether there was a pattern of similar complaints. Porter finally lost his composure and said something about how they were just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. Daniel's response was swift and cutting. He said that harassing law-abiding citizens did not make anyone safer. He pointed out that while Porter and Hoffman had been wasting time interrogating his mother, they could have been doing actual police work. He asked how many real crimes had occurred in the city during the 45 minutes they had spent harassing an elderly woman. Daniel then addressed the crowd of witnesses directly. He thanked them for staying and for recording what had happened. He asked if anyone who had witnessed the entire encounter from the beginning would be willing to provide statements. Multiple hands went up. Daniel pulled out a notepad and began taking names and contact information from the witnesses. He explained that their testimony might be crucial in the legal proceedings and investigations that would follow. A woman who identified herself as the paralegal who had spoken up earlier came forward. She said she had recorded video from the moment the officers first approached Margaret and had captured everything that had been said. She gave Daniel her business card and said she would be happy to provide her video and testify about what she had witnessed. Daniel thanked her and said her video evidence would be invaluable. As Daniel was collecting witness information, a car pulled up and a woman got out. She was carrying a camera and a notebook. Daniel greeted her as Linda and introduced her to his mother as an attorney who specialized in civil rights and police misconduct cases. Linda immediately began interviewing Margaret about what had happened, taking detailed notes and asking specific questions about the timeline and exactly what each officer had said and done. While Linda interviewed Margaret, Daniel turned his attention back to the officers. He informed them that in addition to his role as an attorney and his position on the Civilian Oversight Board, he had one more relevant credential they should know about. He mentioned that he had recently been appointed to serve on the City Council's Public Safety Committee, which had direct oversight of the police department's budget and policies. This revelation caused visible alarm among the officers. Their funding, their equipment, their training programs, and even their staffing levels all depended on decisions made by that committee. Daniel continued speaking in a calm but firm tone. He explained that the Public Safety Committee had been examining patterns of police behavior across the city and had been particularly focused on issues of racial profiling and excessive use of authority. He said that what had happened to his mother today was exactly the kind of incident the committee had been created to address. He mentioned that the committee would be holding public hearings next month and that he would be presenting his mother's case as evidence of ongoing problems within the department. Murphy's face had gone from pale to nearly gray. He stammered something about how this really was just a misunderstanding and that surely Daniel could see it from their perspective. Daniel's eyes hardened. He said he could indeed see it from their perspective. And from that perspective, it looked like his mother had been stopped because she was a black woman in a park, and the officers had assumed she must be up to something criminal. He said their perspective was based on racial bias, whether they wanted to admit it or not. Porter tried once more to defend himself by saying that race had nothing to do with it. Daniel asked him directly whether he had stopped any white people in the park that day. Porter did not answer. Daniel asked if he had questioned the white woman with the stroller about where she lived and where she got her money. Porter remained silent. Daniel asked if he had searched the belongings of the white man with the dog. Still no answer. Daniel said the silence was answer enough. Hoffman made the mistake of suggesting that maybe Margaret had seemed more suspicious than the other people in the park. Daniel immediately challenged him to explain exactly what had been suspicious about an elderly woman sitting on a bench feeding birds. Hoffman could not provide a coherent answer. He mumbled something about her purse looking expensive and her behavior seeming nervous. Daniel pointed out that her purse was over 30 years old, and that if she had seemed nervous, it was probably because 2 armed police officers had approached her for no reason and made her feel threatened. Daniel then shared another piece of information that made the officers even more uncomfortable. He mentioned that he was not just familiar with the law enforcement protocols for this district, but he had actually helped write some of them. He had served on the task force that developed the city's guidelines for police interactions with citizens after the previous civil rights settlement. He said these guidelines specifically prohibited the kind of behavior the officers had engaged in today. He asked Murphy if he had read those guidelines and whether he had trained his officers on them. Murphy said he had, which made the situation even worse because it meant the officers had violated policies they should have been aware of. Another car arrived, and this time it was a reporter from the city's largest newspaper along with a photographer. Daniel had called in his favor, and the press was now on the scene. The reporter immediately began asking questions about what had happened. Daniel provided a clear and detailed account, making sure to emphasize the facts and avoid emotional language. He let the facts speak for themselves. An elderly retired school teacher sitting in a park, 6 police officers, no crime committed, no evidence of wrongdoing, just an assumption that she did not belong there. The photographer began taking pictures of Margaret, of the officers, of the crowd of witnesses, and of the scene in general. Porter tried to object to being photographed, but the reporter informed him that he had no expectation of privacy while performing his duties as a police officer in a public place. The reporter asked Murphy for a statement. Murphy declined to comment and said that the department would be issuing an official statement later. The reporter wrote that down and noted that the lieutenant had refused to explain why 6 officers had detained an elderly woman in a park. Linda finished her interview with Margaret and came over to speak with Daniel. She said that based on what Margaret had told her and what she had observed, they had an extremely strong case for civil rights violations. She mentioned that she had already started drafting a formal complaint that would be filed with Internal Affairs, the Civilian Oversight Board, and the State Attorney General's office. She said they could also file a federal lawsuit under Section 1983 for deprivation of rights under color of law. Daniel nodded and said he wanted to pursue every available avenue. He wanted formal complaints filed. He wanted an internal affairs investigation. He wanted the officers disciplined. He wanted policy changes to prevent this from happening to anyone else. And he wanted compensation for his mother for the emotional distress and humiliation she had endured. Linda said she would have all the paperwork ready within 24 hours. The police commissioner finally arrived on the scene. He was an older man with silver hair, wearing a dark suit rather than a uniform. He looked around at the crowd, the reporters, the cameras, and the 6 uncomfortable officers, and Margaret could see him trying to assess how bad this situation was going to be for his department. He walked directly to Daniel and shook his hand. The 2 men obviously knew each other. The commissioner said he had come as soon as he got the call and asked Daniel to brief him on what had happened. Daniel provided a concise summary, sticking to facts and timeline. He pointed out the officers involved, mentioned the witnesses and video evidence, and explained the various legal violations that had occurred. The commissioner listened with a deepening frown. When Daniel finished, the commissioner turned to Murphy and asked if this account was accurate. Murphy hesitated, clearly torn between supporting his officers and acknowledging the truth. Finally, he admitted that the basic facts were correct, though he tried to add some qualifying language about the officers' intentions. The commissioner cut him off. He said that intentions were irrelevant if the actions violated policy and the law. He turned back to Daniel and said that he wanted to apologize on behalf of the department for what had happened to Margaret. He said this was not acceptable behavior and would be dealt with seriously. Daniel thanked him for the apology but said that words were not enough. He wanted to see concrete actions and accountability. The commissioner nodded and said he would personally oversee the investigation. He told Murphy to take Porter and Hoffman back to the station immediately and to relieve them of duty pending the investigation. He said that he was also putting Murphy on administrative duty until the investigation was complete, because he had failed to properly handle the situation when he arrived. The three officers tried to protest, but the commissioner held up his hand and said his decision was final. The commissioner then approached Margaret directly. He apologized to her personally and said that what had happened to her was wrong and should never have occurred. He said he hoped she would cooperate with the investigation and that the department would do everything possible to make things right. Margaret looked at this powerful man who was suddenly being so apologetic and respectful, and she wondered why that respect and consideration had not been shown to her by his officers from the beginning. Daniel put his arm around his mother and said it was time to take her home. He told the commissioner that he would be in touch and that he expected regular updates on the investigation. The commissioner agreed and gave Daniel his personal cell phone number, saying he could call any time. As Daniel led Margaret toward his car, the crowd of witnesses broke into applause. People called out words of support and encouragement. Someone said that Margaret was a hero for standing up to police harassment. Margaret did not feel like a hero. She just felt tired and emotionally drained. As they drove away from the park, Margaret looked back and saw the officers standing in a group, their body language defeated and uncertain. The crowd of witnesses was still there, still recording, still bearing witness to what had happened. The reporter and photographer were interviewing people and gathering statements. Margaret realized that what had started as a terrible personal experience had become something larger, a public incident that might actually lead to change. The story of what happened to Margaret Williams in Riverside Park spread quickly through the city. By that evening, the video recordings from multiple witnesses had been posted online and had been viewed thousands of times. The newspaper article appeared the next morning on the front page with a photograph of Margaret sitting on the bench surrounded by officers. The headline read, "Retired teacher detained by police while feeding birds in park." The article included statements from witnesses, details about the officers involved, and quotes from Daniel about the civil rights violations that had occurred. Within days, the story had been picked up by news outlets across the country. It became part of a larger national conversation about racial profiling, police accountability, and the treatment of elderly citizens by law enforcement. People were outraged that a 72-year-old woman could be subjected to such treatment simply for sitting in a park. Community leaders and civil rights organizations called for swift action against the officers involved and for systematic reforms to prevent similar incidents. The internal affairs investigation moved quickly, partly because the evidence was so clear, and partly because the police commissioner knew the department was under intense public scrutiny. Investigators interviewed all 6 officers involved, reviewed the video footage from witnesses, and took statements from more than a dozen people who had been in the park that day. The findings were damning for Officers Porter and Hoffman. The investigation concluded that they had engaged in racial profiling, had conducted an unlawful detention, had performed an illegal search, and had falsified information when calling for backup. Lieutenant Murphy was found to have failed in his duty as a supervisor by not properly assessing the situation and by allowing the unlawful detention to continue even after he arrived. The other 3 officers who had responded to the backup call were given official reprimands for failing to question the basis for the detention and for not intervening when they should have recognized that their colleagues were violating department policy and constitutional rights. 3 months after the incident in the park, the police commission held a public hearing to announce the results of the investigation and the disciplinary actions that would be taken. The hearing room was packed with community members, reporters, and concerned citizens. Margaret sat in the front row with Daniel beside her. She had been nervous about attending, worried about facing the officers again, but Daniel had encouraged her to be there. He told her that her presence would be important and that people needed to see her strength and dignity. The police commissioner took the podium and began by acknowledging that the department had failed Margaret Williams and had violated the trust of the community. He announced that officers Porter and Hoffman were being terminated from the police force effective immediately. He explained that their conduct had been so far outside acceptable standards that termination was the only appropriate response. He said that Lieutenant Murphy was being demoted and reassigned to a position with no supervisory responsibilities. The other 3 officers were being suspended without pay for 30 days and would be required to complete additional training on constitutional rights and appropriate police procedures. But the commissioner did not stop with individual punishments. He announced a series of policy changes that would be implemented department-wide. All officers would be required to complete updated training on racial bias, constitutional rights, and appropriate grounds for detaining and searching citizens. The department would implement a new early warning system to identify officers who received multiple complaints about their conduct. Body cameras would become mandatory for all patrol officers, and the footage would be automatically flagged for review whenever an officer detained someone for more than 15 minutes. The commissioner also announced the creation of a community liaison program that would assign officers to build relationships with residents in the neighborhoods they patrolled. The goal was to change the culture of policing from one of suspicion and enforcement to one of partnership and service. He acknowledged that these changes would take time and effort, but said the department was committed to rebuilding trust with the community. When the commissioner finished his announcement, he invited Margaret to come to the podium if she wished to speak. Margaret had not prepared any remarks, but she stood up and walked slowly to the front of the room. She stood at the podium for a moment, looking out at all the faces turned toward her. Then she began to speak in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the room. She said that she had spent 35 years as a schoolteacher, teaching children that America was a country where everyone was equal under the law. She said that she had believed in that principle and had tried to instill it in her students. But what happened to her in the park that day had shaken her faith. She said that for 45 minutes she had been treated as if she were a criminal, as if she did not belong in her own neighborhood, as if the color of her skin made her automatically suspicious. Margaret said that she was glad the officers were being held accountable, but she hoped that this incident would lead to something more than just punishment. She said she hoped it would lead to real change in how police officers thought about the people they were supposed to serve and protect. She said that every person, regardless of their race or age or appearance, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. She said that she hoped no other elderly woman would have to experience what she had experienced, and no other family would have to watch their loved one be humiliated and frightened by those who were supposed to keep them safe. When Margaret finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. People stood up and the applause continued for several minutes. Margaret walked back to her seat with tears in her eyes, and Daniel hugged her tightly. After the hearing ended, dozens of people came up to Margaret to thank her for speaking out and to tell her how much her courage meant to them. Several elderly black women hugged her and said they had experienced similar treatment from police over the years but had never felt they could speak up about it. The city reached a settlement with Margaret 2 weeks later. The terms were confidential, but sources close to the negotiations said the amount was substantial, reflecting not just compensation for her ordeal, but also punitive damages meant to send a message to the police department. Daniel announced that his mother would be donating a significant portion of the settlement to establish a legal defense fund for low-income residents who experience police misconduct but could not afford legal representation. The fund was named the Margaret Williams Community Justice Fund, and Daniel's law firm agreed to provide pro bono legal services to qualifying cases. Within the first 6 months, the fund helped more than 20 families file complaints against officers who had violated their rights. Several of those complaints resulted in disciplinary actions against officers and policy changes in how certain situations were handled. Margaret became something of a local hero and reluctant activist. She was invited to speak at community meetings, church gatherings, and town halls about her experience and about the need for police accountability. She always emphasized that she did not hate police officers and that she understood they had a difficult job. But she also insisted that difficult jobs did not excuse violations of people's rights and that power without accountability led to abuse. Daniel used his mother's case as a catalyst for broader reforms. Through his work on the Civilian Oversight Board and the City Council's Public Safety Committee, he pushed for changes in police training, hiring practices, and accountability systems. He worked with community organizations to develop programs that brought police and residents together in non-enforcement contexts, helping officers see the people they served as neighbors rather than potential suspects. 6 months after the incident, Margaret returned to Riverside Park for the first time since that terrible afternoon. She was nervous as she approached her favorite bench, worried about how she would feel being back in the place where she had been so frightened and humiliated. But Daniel came with her, as did several friends from her church and some of the witnesses who had stood up for her that day. They had a small gathering at the bench, and someone brought flowers. The paralegal who had recorded the video came and gave Margaret a long hug. The man who had been walking his dog stopped by and told Margaret how glad he was to see her back in the park where she belonged. Slowly, Margaret felt some of the fear and anxiety begin to fade. This was her park, her neighborhood, and no one could take that away from her. Over time, Margaret resumed her routine of visiting the park several times a week to feed the birds and enjoy the sunshine. Sometimes she would see police officers on patrol in the park, and while she felt a moment of anxiety each time, the officers always nodded respectfully to her or even stopped to say hello. The department had used her case in training sessions, and her photo was recognized by officers throughout the city. They knew she was the woman whose courage had led to important changes in how they did their jobs. 1 year after the incident, the city held a ceremony to recognize individuals who had made significant contributions to improving police-community relations.